the gang, so I'm just going to turn it over to Stockton and let him take off. Okay.
Thanks, Ray. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. We're really excited to see some of you joining us. I know it's a holiday weekend, so thanks for taking some time out of your busy holiday weekend to hang out with us. We'd like to especially welcome people who are streaming us live and people who will be viewing this later on some archive footage. Everything that we do here on our first Saturday of the month appearance at Williams Music First is recorded and posted for archival purposes, particularly for educational students who are maybe in rural areas who can't travel to Dallas on a Saturday morning to talk about jazz music. And so we just want to Check 1, 2. Can you hear me now, James? Check, check. Check, check. Hey guys, thanks, sorry. How about a hand for on tenor saxophone and our arranger, David Lown? On trombone, professor of trombone from the University of North Texas, Mr. Tony Baker. On trumpet, joining us for the first time, although I've known him a long time, Mr. Pete Claggett. And as per usual, from the deepest, darkest parts of Nova Scotia, Canada, on piano, Josh Hanlon. Well, Duke is a really interesting jazz figure, primarily because he bridges the gap of Dixieland and New Orleans music that was particularly made famous by the great Louis Armstrong, who was the subject of our presentation last month. And he took the ideas and concepts he was learning about both improvisation and blending different types of instruments and the sound of those instruments together, and he slowly started adding people to his group until he had a big band, one of the earliest and first big bands. And then he was able to transition that into being probably the greatest big band leader of the big band age and beyond. And there are so many songs that are uniquely linked to him. And one of his earlier tunes that I really love is the next one we're going to play. It's entitled Mood Indigo. Although the first time he performed it, he wrote it specifically for one of his early radio broadcasts, which was a very big deal. And it was one of the reasons why Duke had such a far-reaching effect on the culture of the United States. It's because a lot of his performances, particularly his big band performances from a club in Harlem called the Cotton Club, were transmitted all over the United States, not just regionally in the New York area. And it's really interesting that even Louis Armstrong, when he was living in Chicago, liked to tune in and listen to Duke Ellington's band. Even though a trumpet player named Bubber Miley, who really was influential in Duke establishing his early sound, was a huge fan of Louis Armstrong and was greatly impacted by the first time he was in Chicago and saw Louis Armstrong playing with King Oliver's band. So it's really funny the synergy that both Louis Armstrong and Duke had together. And it's of particular interest that they made an album together many, many years later when they were both in the twilight years of their career. And it's called Duke and Satchmo. And it's really a fascinating record where they're playing together. And when you read tales about them meeting and working, everyone expected them not to get along because they were such notorious rivals from a career standpoint. But everyone was really amazed at how they respected each other and worked well together. And on that album, they actually do a version of Mood Indigo. It's one of my favorite Duke tunes. And it's a tune that I also play regularly with Doc Severinsen, who is a giant fan of Louis Armstrong and a giant fan of Duke Ellington, and he makes sure that we play their music every concert. And so I took a stab at doing some kind of different type of arranging ideas with this tune because it always sounded to me, even though it was a blues, it sounded very symphonic to me, and I wanted to try to capture some of that. And I guess I was inspired a little bit by it being the 4th of July weekend, and I wanted to try to get a little bit of that really pretty chorale sound we're used to hearing. So this is my, my humble attempt at arranging Duke Ellington's great classic, Mood Indigo.
Thank you so much. Hey, that's Tony Baker again on trombone. How about a hand for Tony? And Josh Hanlon again on piano over there. It's a really pretty song, and one of the fascinating things about Duke and the longevity of his career is that he never stopped experimenting and, in his words, attempting to perfect his music. And Mood Indigo was one of those tunes that he wrote in the late 20s and spent the rest of his life rearranging and experimenting with ways of voicing it. And one of the most unique aspects of Ellington is everything he wrote, he really attempted to cater to the specific, unique sounds of the individuals he hired for his band. And he liked to focus on what was, I think, interesting and encompassing of a player and write things that fit them. And there's all kinds of really famous jazz musicians who passed through the Duke Ellington Orchestra, but some of the marquee names that we all know include Johnny Hodges, very famous alto saxophonist who David Lowndes is going to speak about here in a moment. And then it also featured a great baritone saxophone, really the first well-known baritone saxophonist named Harry Carney. And he really set the standard for what was possible on that instrument. Tricky Sam Nanton was an amazing trombonist who really helped pioneer plunger-style playing on the trombone. And then after Bubber Miley left the band, the most famous jazz trumpet player to spend time in Duke Ellington's orchestra was the great Cootie Williams, who couldn't even play plunger trumpet when he joined the band and set out to perfect it because Bubber Miley was so great at it. And then, as everyone said, he ended up greatly outpacing what even Bubber was able to do with that plunger mute. And I think that it's always inspiring to hear that as time went by and Duke's personnel in his band changed, he would write differently. He would write different arrangements, say, of Mood Indigo to feature a new up-and-coming player in his band, as opposed to just doing the same arrangement he'd always done for some of those past entities that were in there. So that's just one of the many fascinating aspects of Duke. Well, one of the other really interesting things about him, as I said earlier, is he is jazz's most prolific composer. Nobody has contributed more jazz standards to this great body of work that we call the Great American Songbook as Duke Ellington did, both himself and some of it co-writing with Billy Strayhorn. And a lot of it gets very confusing. If you look up who wrote these tunes, you'll see Duke's name, and then you'll sometimes see all kinds of other strange names associated with it. Usually you'll see someone with the last name Mills, M-I-L-L-S. Irving Mills was his music publisher. And back in the 20s and 30s, particularly African-American musicians were taken advantage of hugely by the music industry. And they were doing so much that no one even thought anything weird about it. And Irving Mills was one of these people who claimed he helped Duke streamline these tunes and insisted his name be on every composition, because then he was entitled to a fairly large percentage of the profits from that tune. And then many of these tunes, such as the one we're going to talk about for our song of the day today, Satin Doll, were instrumental tunes that Duke wrote that, in an attempt to turn more money for them, his publisher Irving Mills would insist lyrics be written for them, even though Duke had no lyrics in mind when he composed the tune. And then they would re-record it with a vocalist, and then they'd usually put the lyricist's name on it. I think the better lyrics that you'll hear on many of Duke's songs were from the great Johnny Mercer, who at the very least was a stellar musician in his own right. And I believe he did write the lyrics to Satin Doll, if I'm remembering correctly. So if you've never really taken a chance to explore the wonderful, rich history of Duke Ellington, we're hoping to inspire you to do so today. As I always say, I have what I call my jazz Mount Rushmore. I'm still shopping for a mountain to carve, but if I had my own jazz Mount Rushmore, the 4 individuals I would place on it would be Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Miles Davis, and John Coltrane, because of their mammoth impact both on jazz music and America's culture at large. The United States culturally, and especially with music, would not be what it is today with each of those individuals' influence. And so Duke is one of these marquee names. And when you hear people like the great Wynton Marsalis, yes, Duke. Wynton Marsalis at Lincoln Center has been, no pun intended, trumpeting this mantra of the greatness of Duke Ellington for 25 years, and with very great reason, understanding how important he is. So what we're going to look at now is the tune of the week, which is Satin Doll, which, unfortunately, I totally forgot to mail the files to Ray Gore to print for everybody here today. But the good news is, for people who will be watching this archivally and streaming it, they will be posted on Williamson's website, and it's totally my goof. I forgot to attach a zipped file. Don't you hate when you do that? So we unfortunately don't have a lead sheet for Satin Doll. But what we'll do is we're going to play through it once so that everyone can become acquainted with it. Now, one thing I did remember to do is include a one-page worksheet that has a little bit about the song. It's entitled Session Number 7, Duke Ellington. And it talks about the form AABA, or a slang for it is Tin Pan Alley form, or some people just simply call it song form. But other than the 12-bar blues, it is the most prevalent song form that jazz musicians use. And Satin Doll follows this AABA form. There's a little bit of information I wrote on the sheet if you want to read a little bit more about why we call it Tin Pan Alley. But these were, in particularly, popular songs in the United States because they were appearing in Broadway musicals and on radio programs. Television still wasn't the dominant form of entertainment in our country, and so people were tuning into their radios, and people were going to see live Broadway shows and hearing a lot of AABA-formed tunes. So it was a very common place to start if you wrote an AABA tune for an audience. They were very familiar with it. And as those headings entail, AABA, the A sections have similar content, as you will hear. And then the B, which is slangily called the bridge, has different content, both harmonically. You'll hear that the piano and bass are playing different chords, and then the melody will respect that as well. And most AABA forms are a grand total of 32 measures long, with each sub-phrase being 8 bars long. 8 bars of A, 8 bars of A, 8 bars of B, 8 bars of A. And then, like a typewriter, ding, when you get to the end, it resets over and over. Young people won't know what a typewriter is. Go to a museum and look for a typewriter. It's an ancient device that I wrote my papers on in high school. And so it just goes over and over and over. And so when we improvise, we continuously follow the form. And one of our big missions here is to always try to demystify what jazz improvisation is so that we can unlock the joys of it rather than be intimidated by it. And as I always say, there are a great deal of rights and wrongs, do's and don'ts when it comes to learning to improvise in jazz. We are not playing randomly whatever we feel, however we feel like playing it. That is not something we have the right to do. We are following form all the time, such as in Satin Doll with AABA. And because we're following that form, the harmony or the chords are attached to the measures within each of those phrases. So we're following a specific map at all times. So we're going to play the melody once for you to get it in your ear. Dave's going to play it for you here, and we'll let you hear it. So just keep in mind, 8 bars, 8 bars, 8 bars, and 8 bars, A, A, B, A. Let's see if you can hear the difference.
Intro or right on?
What's that?
Intro or?
Let's just start right on the head. Right on the head. A 1, a 2, a 1, 2, a 3. A, B, A. And there's so many of Duke's tunes that are really well known. This is most definitely one of those tunes that every professional jazz musician has played hundreds and hundreds of times. And it's just a very common, popular standard for people to play. Even people who do not share the same spoken language can sit down and play a Duke Ellington tune like Satin Doll. And there's all kinds of great versions of it with the lyrics, which can also help you get a deeper understanding of the melody, particularly its phrasing. And I love the way Ella Fitzgerald sings it personally, although there's a great Nancy Wilson version as well. So Dave is going to be talking a little bit about an approach to improvisation over this tune. And he's going to be talking about motivic development and using motifs when you solo. And Satin Doll is just as motivic as any great classical tune. You hear him taking a very short motive and moving it around the same way we hear people like Beethoven going da 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 da. Duke was doing the same thing. But what is particularly fascinating for me, especially considering the time period that these songs were composed, is Duke specifically did not listen to classical music, which surprises a lot of people. He had no interest in listening to classical music because to him it represented the same old crusty white European elitist approach that was hampering every aspect of his life as a young man growing up in Washington, D.C., being African American. He didn't want anything to do with that. And as Duke said multiple times, he was more interested in focusing on his cultural heritage and promoting the excellence of that. And I titled today's presentation, The Elegance of Ellington, because I think that he had some very specific and very firm views of what he wanted to do in relation to his art and using his art to dignify his ethnic culture, but he never did so with anger or aggressiveness. He always did so with kindness and excellence. And those things are what helped propel him to the forefront of jazz music, despite the color of his skin, in a time period in our country where that was the #1 roadblock for most musicians. And so I think it's just really interesting how he was able, on his own, musically, to come up with the idea of motivic development, having not spent any time studying European classical music. So keep that in mind as Dave expounds on his improvisational approach to this tune. Dave?
Thanks, man. Morning, how you guys doing? So Johnny Hodges was one of the defining voices of the Ellington Band. And he was so influential that many saxophonists, most saxophonists who have come after him have been, have really played with a lot of his concepts. And so one of the big things that Johnny Hodges would do would be to organize his ideas using motives. So a motive is the smallest identifiable musical idea. It's usually 2, 3, or 4 notes. So I have here the first 2 A sections of Johnny Hodges' solo on Satin Doll. And in each 4-measure phrase, he's using one small idea to organize the entire phrase. So I want to take you through those and just point out to you exactly what it is that he's doing and then play the phrase for you. So if you look at the first line where you have the light blue notes, Johnny Hodges is using the 5, the 3, and the 5 in the key of C. And then in the second 2 bars, he moves it up a step to match the chords. So if you listen to that in the context of his phrase, it's kind of hidden in there, but it's in there, and it organizes his idea. And then in the second line, he's using this low-high shape that gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So the first one you see, the first 2 red notes, it's an octave. Then the next 2, another octave but lower. Then a 5th. And then the last, at the end of the phrase, a minor 3rd. So if you put that in the context of the whole phrase, it organizes the whole thing. Okay? The third line, he's just using this little tiny 5 to 3 in the key of C. It's buried there in the second measure of the third line. 5 to 3 in the key of C major. And then he again moves it up a step, 5 to 3 in the key of D major. So 5 to 3 in the key of C major. Then he moves it up a step. So how does the line sound? Organizes the whole thing. Then finally, in the last line, it's pretty angular and weird, but he organizes it by constantly putting this low-high octave in multiple times. So concert C up to C, then B flat to B flat, then G to G, and then finally C to C again. So the whole thing so there's always a motive organizing it. And what's really cool is, after Johnny Hodges, we see all these great saxophonists doing the same exact thing. Sonny Rollins, major motivic player. John Coltrane used motives. He was a huge fan of Johnny Hodges. He really impacted everybody after him, so he's an important person, and hope that was helpful.
I'll tell you what, because we don't have the worksheet here so we can play together, what we'll do really quickly is we're going to let Tony, Pete, and Dave each play a chorus for you that they're going to improvise, and they're going to demonstrate how they would use a motivic approach to soloing over this tune. And you're going to hear them all approach it differently. We'll start with Dave, and you can see if you can spot what they're moving around and what they're it's like musical recycling, really, is what they're doing. It's like I drank this soda, now I'm going to turn it into a Christmas ornament. I don't know, something like that. Maybe that wasn't the best recycling analogy. I haven't been working on my recycling analogies lately. Here you go. A 2, 1, 2. of motivic development in all of their solos, but to me, they all still sound like themselves. It's not something that sterilizes their unique musical characteristics. As a matter of fact, I think it frames it. I think you hear their creativity even more obviously in the way that you hear their thought process of motivic development. I was thinking as we were doing it that this is, I think, the way you ought to learn the language improvisationally. You don't want to sit around and like ad nauseum worry about the chord and the scale that goes with it. That is important. But my daughter Liliana's back there, and she's learning to talk. And I don't come home every day and see her and start drilling her on sentence syntax. You know what I mean? Like, okay, what's the indirect object of that sentence, Lily? I don't do that. What do? We just have conversation. We have short, fragmented conversation. And then we try to motivically develop from that by taking a phrase and turning it. That's how we learn. We know that that's how we all learn to speak. And this is very linguistic when we play jazz music. And when you play that way, it lets us in the rhythm section have something to grab onto. And that's what we're going to start talking about a little bit here. Because as I always say, it's not just the soloist in jazz music who is improvising. The jazz rhythm section is improvising 100% of the time. And it's one of the greatest challenges to the people who are playing in the jazz rhythm section. It's often a giant question mark for music educators. What in the world do I do with my rhythm section? Well, the best thing you can always do is send them to the music. Say, get this album and play along with it 100 times. Play along with it until you sound like the drummer on this album, until you sound like this pianist. And they're going to say, well, I don't know what to do. Can you write anything out? Absolutely not. It's an oral language. You need to listen to it. The more you have oral frame of reference for what you're hearing, the more the written language makes sense, which is why it's always best to start with it. And each of these instruments have slightly different roles. And in particular, I know James is going to hint at this, and I will too, these instruments were really in their formative years in jazz music when Duke Ellington was writing his first tunes and putting his first bands together. And particularly the bass and drums had some pretty giant leaps in their roles and their functionality in jazz music in the 1920s, late 20s, early 30s when Duke was experimenting with a lot of this music. So we will start with Duke's instrument. We're going to start with Josh Hanlon talking about the piano and its role on this tune. Josh?
Yeah, well, if you think about the other two instruments in the rhythm section, they're both very gestural. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if you listen to a recording and you hear them do something on that recording and you're sitting at your instrument, well, then you just do what you hear them do. With the piano, it's a little harder because there's that inherent spelling of the harmony that is required, the sort of depth of information that require, I mean, I know we're working on some piano lessons now, and it's like, what's the third of the chord? What's the seventh of the chord? So the worksheet is largely about that. But Duke was a very gestural player. He would hear what was going on around him as in his head as a composer before he played, or, you know, just as a pianist. And he would play exactly what was necessary, and it would sound like it was exactly what was necessary. Now, he came up in D.C. I have to say as an aside that on my first trip to Washington, D.C., it was sort of fortuitous. I was working on a cruise ship, and we were in dry dock, and all the people on the cruise ship took a trip to Washington, D.C. And it was beautiful. The cherry blossoms were in bloom, and we went into the Smithsonian, and it was the last day of the Duke Ellington exhibit at the Smithsonian that we just happened to catch. Wow. And I will admit that at the very end of the exhibit, his personal piano was sitting there, and I did touch a key behind the ribbon. That's not something I'm prone to do, but I didn't play a note, but I did touch a key.
That was the sacred concert piano, right? The Smithsonian has the piano that he played and recorded the sacred concert on, I think.
Yeah.
I was reading that. Is that what it was?
I thought it was his personal. It was a white grand piano.
I think that was the one they have one he used on the sacred concert as well, that I guess that they'll put out and let people play. And
well, that could be it.
Wow.
Anyway, I've been there. Anyway, Duke came up playing society gigs in D.C., and the mode of playing in the early 20th century of those jazz society gigs was very wide, was very flourishy. And so Duke was always very capable of that. But he was always a melodist. In fact, the most interesting comparison I can think of to another player is strangely one of the other great composers of the 20th century is Thelonious Monk. If you listen carefully to their small group work, there are a lot of interesting comparisons you can make, especially since there are two albums that the three albums that I think of, because Duke did a record with Train, and Monk also did a record with Train, and then Monk did a record of Duke's music. And all three of those combined to create a very interesting connection between their music. So when you listen to Duke's piano playing, listen for those specific, perfect ideas, the minimum necessary, and also the width of the piano that he uses. Sometimes it's very complicated for a beginner to do that. You have to remember that Duke learned to spell all that and have that dialogue to create that sense of gesturality. So I provided the same sort of information that if you were to show up and play piano on a gig, you would need to know how to play your basic voicings. And so that's what I provided is an insight to that same sort of language.
I remember reading that when Duke was in D.C. growing up, Dixieland and ragtime stride piano was huge. And Duke actually, believe it or not, the great orchestrator he was, he couldn't read music well when he was first starting out. And there was a new James P. Johnson solo that came out, and he bought the roll so that he could play it on a player piano so that he could see the keys move, and they found a way to hack it where they would slow it down to half speed. And he figured out how to play James P. Johnson's tune by just putting his fingers where the keys went down. And then a couple years after that, James P. Johnson came to Washington, D.C. for a concert, and Duke got to meet him and played this tune, which was apparently really hard. And it impressed James P. Johnson so much, he spent the whole night hanging out with Duke. And Duke said he got the equivalent of an entire college education that night hanging out with James P. Johnson. But so many of these early jazz pianists, like Count Basie up in Kansas City, they were coming out of that New Orleans stride, which got them moving all up and down the keyboard,
right.
Which I think it's amazing how I'll meet great young modern jazz pianists who can't play. They can't even touch that stuff. It's just really humbling. And I think very similar to early jazz pianists having roots in that stride piano playing. Same thing with drummers. I mean, rudimentally, they were all coming out of playing military-style drumming, which is why they all had absolutely amazing hands, which is lacking in a lot of young drummers today. They want to skip that aspect of it and get caught up in the four-way coordination. But before I selfishly talk about drums all day, let's let James talk a little bit about the bass, which was going through some fascinating transitions as well at this time period. James?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you think about Duke and the way he elevated each instrument, including the bass, I think you have to put it in its historical context. I mean, here's a guy that wrote music from the teens until the mid-'70s. So you're talking about the earliest jazz until 5 years beyond when the Beatles broke up. So, and what was the bass doing in each period? And so it's hard to pinpoint one thing. I've kind of come up with a couple main things that you can take away from it. He wasn't one to miss an opportunity, right, when it came to composition and orchestration. So the first thing he probably realized about the bass was that you don't have to blow into it, right? It's not a tuba, but it occupies the same frequency range. So there was this guy named Wellman Bro. He's a Creole guy, B-R-A-U-D. That's how you spell his last name. And he came along in the mid-'20s and was a guy that could play arco style with a bow, and also was kind of made this slap technique pretty famous. There's recordings of him in 1927 playing Washington Wobble. And sure enough, he's walking, I'm not going to attempt it, but he's walking with the bow in 4/4 time, and he's also playing in 2/beat. He was the first guy that was really credited with making the walking bass a style, and that's still how we play today. When he left the band, they replaced him with 2 bass players, And that was something that continued with Duke all along. He had 2 bass players in his band quite often.
And you know you're good when they have to get 2 people.
Yeah,
to replace
well,
you. You must be pretty good.
yeah. Well, the next guy, and the guy that's most associated with him, is this guy Jimmy Blanton, and he was kind of this freak because he was a virtuoso on the instrument. I mean, it was one of those Art Tatum type things where the classical guys were coming to check out the gigs because they wanted to see what was going on. There's a famous recording called Pitter Panther Patter. If you ever get a chance to listen to it, it's a duo recording, just Duke and Jimmy Blanton playing. There's actually, I think, a couple of records at least, or I don't know if they're records, but the recordings of just the 2 of them playing. I want to keep some time. I have a little
Sure.
transcription.
Yeah.
Of it. I'm going to try to play the A section here. Let's do it like in 1, 2. Yeah. Anyway, that's at the time. It's still very hard to play, but he was one of these guys that would turn his hand around too. So if you watch like Ray Brown and guys even all the way, and even today, his thing was to play with the whole part of your finger, and to get that sound and get the bass resonating. And so, let's see, the next guy that's a big name associated with him is this guy, Oscar Pettiford. And by that time, you know, bebop was kind of the thing. There's a famous recording, the 1947 Carnegie Hall concert with 2 bass players. There's a piece called Basso Profundo. I would check it out if you're interested in this stuff. It's 2 bassists, and they're just trading on and off. Duke's obviously written some parts out for him, or somebody did. But then they trade solos, and it's pretty fascinating. But another example of him being this orchestrator and thinking, man, the bass can do all these amazing things. Let's take advantage of it. That's a theme. When I was thinking about what to talk about, I thought, what can you say about Duke in relation to elevating the bass? He always wrote for the players, right? So as opposed to just saying, well, here's the bass part, and whoever gets to play it plays it, he kind of came at it from the other way and saying, I'm going to write specifically for this person to play these parts. So in my supplement here, I tried to just write at the end of some phrases some playfulness in the bass part, but mainly a timekeeping role. But anyway, that's a little bit about the bass as it pertains to Duke Ellington.
Yeah, absolutely. Great job, James. So yeah, it's I mean, these guys, you know, like Jimmy Blanton and some of these names we throw out. I mean, they were quantum leaps in development of what was going on, which we hear this language commonplace now. But when Jimmy Blanton was doing this, I mean, it was very similar to when Louis Armstrong first started improvising. People actually wouldn't even clap when he was done because they were in complete shock at what they had just heard, and they were just so overwhelmed, not even knowing an instrument could make those sounds, that they didn't even know what to do to show their appreciation. And Blanton was one of those guys on the bass where they were just like, is that even a bass still? Like, they didn't even know what was happening because they knew it sounded great, but they didn't think they thought those were impossible things to play, very similar to early things that Louis Armstrong would play. They're like, the trumpet can't do those things. And he was doing them all the time, all night long. Well, the drums were going through a big transition at the same time period and evolving the same way that the bass was evolving. And it, you know, as I've always said, this is the youngest instrument on the bandstand in regards to jazz music. It's barely 100 years old, and it was just kind of a collection or contraption back then. And the first famous drummer with Duke Ellington was one of his friends from Washington, D.C., Sonny Greer, who was with him for a long, long time. And when you hear earliest versions of Sonny playing, Sonny was a vaudeville drummer, so it's very showy. It sounds even a little cheesy to us now. He's using a lot of what we call traps, because he'd been playing in vaudeville doing sound effects. So he would have like a horn and wood blocks and a cowbell. But as Ellington's compositional approach matured and grew, Sonny grew with it. And he was really one of our first big band drummers to set up a band, to kick a band, to play time differently for different soloists. And he started trying to figure out, how can I change the drums so that they are most appropriate for each soloist and for every musical situation. And one of the things that always stands out to me about Sonny when I read a lot about him and his quotes about his playing is he was 100% committed to serving the needs of the music and his fellow musicians. He was not interested in showcasing himself, and he very rarely played solos, which I thought was very interesting. But then after him, there were two other marquee name drummers who went through Duke's band who were so much different. And matter of fact, when Sonny left the band, they thought he was irreplaceable. People thought the Duke Ellington Orchestra was going to fail because there had always been Sonny Greer at the drums. And they got this young guy named Sam Woodyard, who's a little more rooted in small group playing. And it happened to be the perfect light touch to help play the orchestral approach to some of the music that Duke was writing. And then some years later, to much people's shock, Duke hired the absolute opposite of Sam Woodyard and one of the other big band drumming superstars, a gentleman named Louis Bellson. And Louis was a very much a Buddy Rich type model, chops like crazy. And as per usual, when Louis was on the band, Duke catered everything to Louis' playing. So all the features for him changed. They were much more aggressive, much more drumistic. And so it's just a fascinating, I think the history of the drum set goes directly through Duke Ellington's orchestra, and you can't have modern jazz drumming without the pioneering of those, particularly, they're not the only ones who play with Duke, but those three men are very important. And again, that's Sonny Greer, and then Sam Woodyard, and then later on Louis Bellson. Kind of a fun fact is Sonny Greer was known as having the biggest drum set in the world. He was like always buying stuff, and so it just became one of these kind of like gimmicky things, is that everyone wanted to go see Duke Ellington's band to see what new piece Sonny Greer had added to his drums. And I don't even think he played half of it.
Did they all play two bass drums?
Louis played two bass drums. I think Louis was one of the first to do it. Sonny might have set one up. I mean, they started setting two bass drums up mainly so they could write their name, like Sonny Greer. Like, that's really why they started doing it. And they would start, like, they write Duke Ellington's name. I think that's what he did. I think he stuck a bass drum out there that was attached to nothing, and he wrote Duke Ellington's name on it because he wanted his name to be on his bass drum by himself. I mean, you just never know. It's so funny how business decisions really affected these things. And on the supplement that I provided for everyone, very dissimilar to what James did, what I did was I wrote a functional chorus of note-for-note transcription of what you could play, very much in that Sam Woodyard style. And the big thing about it, and what Sonny Greer started doing and Sam Woodyard really perfected, was everything they played at the drums was directly related to the form of the song and directly taken from the melody of the song. And you'll, if you play through it, the drum thing, you'll hear the tune Satin Doll in the comping. And you hear this in the tradition of Kenny Clark and Max Roach, who helped develop modern-day jazz drumming, all the way through the pioneering in the mid-'60s of Elvin Jones and Tony Williams, and the enigmatic Roy Haynes, who is like the ceaseless wonder who was always present in the history of jazz drumming and always at the forefront of it. And he's 93, and I just saw him play on a video the other day, and he sounded great. I mean, he looks like he's about ready to fall into a pile of dust, but he sounded awesome. I was nervous. I was like, don't die, don't die. Actually, this has nothing to do with Duke Ellington, but Roy Haynes let me sit beside him during a sound check years ago. And I quoted earlier Duke talking about his evening with James P. Johnson being the equivalent of an education. And I sat by Roy Haynes for about an hour, and I could have read 1,000 books and not gotten as much information as I got from it. So if you ever have an opportunity, these greats are passing from us these days. There's very few of them left, and Roy's one of those people. If you ever get a chance, you see Roy Haynes is somewhere nearby, you should go. You know, buy like a tank of oxygen for him and go watch him play. Yes, there was a shocking death in the jazz community this week. Jerry Allen, a great jazz pianist, particularly, I think, a really famous jazz pianist because she's one of the few African-American female jazz pianists who reached such high notoriety. Died suddenly of cancer. She was only 60. Wow. So you just never know when you're going to lose one of these great, great jazz musicians. So we're going to move on now. Any questions about Satin Doll before we do a little more playing for you? Okay, great. So what we're going to do is try to humbly emulate that approach that we talked about of Duke writing for his sidemen. For quite a few years, I play in a trio with Josh and James here. And we've done this version of Duke's classic, Don't Get Around Much Anymore. Don't Get Around Much Anymore is one of his, again, one of his marquee tunes. If you go buy like a Best of Duke Ellington album, you're going to see Satin Doll, Take the A Train, and Don't Get Around Much Anymore on there. And so this is a really nice arrangement that Josh Hanlon did, and he is purposely trying to showcase our great bass player. James is the same name as James Blanton. Coincidence? I don't know. They might be related. Are you related to Jimmy Blanton? You don't look anything like him. So we're gonna feature our famous Jimmy. This is James Jimmy Blanton Driscoll on Don't Get Around Much Anymore. Will you give me the tempo, Josh, so I don't screw it up? 2 bars. A 1, 2, a 1, 2. How about our arranger, Josh Hanlon, on the piano? So I just wanted to share a couple really fascinating things about Duke Ellington before we wrap up today. I thought it was particularly cool that you heard some moments in Josh's arrangement where I played on the floor tom. You remember hearing this sound? It's a very specific sound, and the term that you typically see it referred to as when writing for jazz musicians is we call that a jungle beat or a jungle feel. And this was a very controversial term in Duke Ellington's early days because it was viewed by musicians as derogatory. And they felt like it was used and aimed at African-American jazz musicians to represent them as savages from the jungles of Africa. And I think one of the things that Duke did, as I mentioned earlier, he was always able to take a positive approach to putting down the negativity leveled at him. And rather than run away for it or fight that term, he actually embraced it and started tailoring his music to it. People started referring to those sounds because they would hear trumpet players growling through mutes. That was something King Oliver started in New Orleans and later Chicago, and they called it freak music. And, you know, Tricky Sam was doing it on trombone, and Ellington's band was known for doing those things earlier. And Sonny Greer started playing on floor toms to highlight that jungle-type sound. And Ellington kept writing for it more and more and embracing it, so much so that in the earliest radio broadcasts from the Cotton Club in Harlem, they referred to his band as Duke Ellington and his Jungle Orchestra. And it's funny, there's an interesting anecdote that the first time of the national radio broadcast, Duke's wife and mother in D.C. tuned in to listen to it. And Duke came from a fairly refined family. His father was a butler for a very wealthy person in D.C., which as an aside is how Duke got his nickname Duke, because his father was so refined, very much in a British sense, kind of like Downton Abbey style, proper speaking. And Duke grew up with that and really took that on. He really admired the way his father spoke and acted, that his friends nicknamed him Duke for his royal bearing when he was a young man. And so, of course, they said that they tuned into the radio in his mother and father's living room, this elegant place in D.C., and they hear her son announce as Duke Ellington and his Jungle Orchestra, and his wife said his mom about passed out because she just couldn't believe that they were referring to Duke that way. But he wrote many aspects of this type of style into his music and did it with such elegance and such superb musical excellence that everyone now views it as this really coveted stylistic approach to playing. And I really love that sound, so I thought it was cool that Josh snuck that in there. That's one of, I think, one of many key identifiers for the way Ellington wrote. Well, Ellington had a profound impact not only on jazz music, but culture as a greater whole in the United States. And though he was controversial a few times, particularly when he did his sacred concerts, they said he was like pushing organized religion, and he always claimed, I just wanted to write music that mattered to me, and this was important to me to do. I thought it was fascinating to note that in 1956 he was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, and there were, for whatever reason, there were no awards given out that year, so he didn't receive one. But after his death in 1999, in celebration of his 100th year birthday, he was given a special Lifetime Achievement Pulitzer Prize. And in particular, citing not only his innovations in music, but his positive approach to fighting for civil rights through excellence in the way he represented himself, both as a musician and as a business person, in the way he treated his musicians. He also received, I thought this was cool, he got a Presidential Medal of Freedom from Nixon in 1969. There's some really neat pictures of Nixon presenting Duke with that. And there's some really cool footage of it if you search online, but one of the other really notable things that I think spoke to his giant influence was when he passed and they had his funeral in New York City, they had over 12,000 people attend. They were crowding the streets, and a lot of the major news outlets were covering it, showing film of it, and people mourning. And particularly for a lot of famous jazz musicians at that time, I mean, they felt like they had lost the pinnacle of influence on them. As Miles Davis famously was quoted as saying, he said, all jazz musicians at some point should stop down and thank Duke Ellington for everything he did for our music, because we wouldn't be playing jazz music without Duke. And so everyone hold him in the highest regard. One of my former bosses, Maynard Ferguson, said one of his only regrets in his very amazing career was he never had a chance to play in Duke Ellington's band. He was offered a job and he didn't take it, but he always wished he had. And it was funny because Duke met Maynard when he was a boy in Canada leading a band. He was 15 years old in Montreal, Canada, and they stuck Maynard in front of a big band. And he was playing high notes and showing off. And they would have famous bands from the United States come and play for a couple weeks, and Maynard's band would open, and then the guest band would play, and Duke would go up there a couple times a year. And Duke loved Maynard even when he was like 15, 16 years old. He thought he was spectacular. And his famous high note trumpet player, Cat Anderson, whenever he would act up, it was notorious that Duke would threaten him. I said, I'm going to fire you for that little Canadian kid if you don't knock it off. And Maynard always thought that was really funny, that Duke would use him as a threat against Cat Anderson because Maynard loved Cat Anderson so much. Well, we are going to close, as we always do, with an original tune. And one of the reasons I believe this is so absolutely important is just as Duke exemplified his entire career, you can gain so much self-expression not only through your instrument and improvising, but through composition. And Duke was the first person to be viewed equally as a jazz musician and a jazz composer, and really set the standard for that, I think, being the expectation of most jazz musicians in our day and age. You are supposed to be a great player, and you're pretty much supposed to be a great composer. And what we're going to do to end is an arrangement that I did of my friend Josh Hanlon's original tune. And I was very much trying to capture that Ellingtonian approach, which is nowhere close, but it's my humble attempt. And this is a really neat song that Josh wrote for my wife Denise and I when our daughter Liliana was born. And Josh played it on piano and sent it to us, and we listened to it. That's my daughter who was running around somewhere earlier. Maybe this will soothe her. Maybe it'll calm her down. But this is Josh's musical imagining of if famous jazz composer and pianist Lyle Mays, who attended the University of North Texas, if he had met my daughter Liliana, which I think is really fun. So we're going to play this to close. This is If Lyle Met Lily. And one more time, I didn't do a good job of introducing them. I just want to recognize these fine musicians one more time. Graduate of the University of North Texas with his master's and undergraduate's degree. And then he spent a lot of time in New York City making his living as a musician. And he's currently the jazz band director at Carroll Senior High School in Southlake, Texas, where he's cranking out some really wonderfully talented young people and has taken his band to the essentially Ellington finals several times in New York City. So when he talks about Ellington, we know he's talking about it from a point of expertise. Please say thank you to David Lown on the tenor saxophone. And also a graduate of North Texas, great trumpet player, very busy, active freelance player in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And we're really glad he could join us today. He sounds so great. How about a hand for Pete Claggett on the trumpet? And as I mentioned, a wonderful professor of trombone at the University of North Texas, also a longtime member of the Dallas Opera. He can pretty much play any style of music and do it with excellence. Please thank Mr. Tony Baker on the trombone. And also a graduate of the University of North Texas. He was an adjunct professor of piano for some time at North Texas. He was also country music legend Ray Price's last touring pianist for many years. On piano, please thank Josh Hanlon. And on bass, he's the busiest bass player in town, and with great reason. He's not only a great bass player, but he's a great composer and arranger. You've probably heard lots of his music on television and radio and never realized it, because if he's not out playing gigs, he's at home composing and recording music. Please thank James Driscoll on the bass. We would like to, as always, thank the generous support of Williamson Music First for underwriting our endeavors and sponsoring us. We have been able, both here in store and through presentations at schools throughout the Dallas-Fort Worth area this year, we have literally been able to reach hundreds and hundreds of young people and spread the joys of jazz music with them. And it's all thanks to the vision and support of Williamson Music First. And so I just want to have a hand for Williamson Music First for continuing to support us. Can you guys thank them? And I know a lot of you know this because I see regular faces, but we are here the first Saturday of every month doing a new presentation. And next month, we will be presenting bebop and specifically talking about Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker. And it's the next, I think, logical progression from the great music of Louis Armstrong, which we spoke of last month, to Duke Ellington this month, and then diving in to the intricacies of bebop music and Bird and Diz, as they are affectionately nicknamed. So we'll hope that you'll join us, or if you know someone who maybe wants to know more about jazz music or has never heard jazz music, they're always welcome here. You don't have to play necessarily. You're always welcome to bring your friends and hang out. I promise I'll remember to bring the actual sheet music next time. Lame-o me. Sorry about that. So we hope to see you next month. Please find us on Facebook, Helbing Jazz Initiative, or you can go to Williamson Music First website or Facebook page. It's all interleaked. We're easy to find. And if you ever have questions, you can drop us a line through those outlets. So we're going to wrap up here with If Lyle Met Lily. 2 bars. Tony Baker on the trombone, Josh Hanlon on the piano, James Driscoll on the bass. Thank you so much for spending some of your holiday weekend with us. Hope you have a great 4th of July. We'll see you next month for some Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker. Thanks, everybody.